Okay, the second slide here, the second video here, we're talking about Parker's Big Blonde, was published in 1929. This story is fairly straightforward, self-explanatory. It's not something that takes a great deal of, I'll move myself again, takes a great deal of explanation. It's not a very happy story, is it? But it's a story that is, we need to place it in its historical context because you miss a lot if you don't know what was going on during that era. So first of all, again, experimenting with different kinds of subjects and techniques and that sort of thing. You can look at the narrative technique here. It's very dry and very straightforward, very blunt, but with ironic twists and turns and phrases that she uses every now and then. Things that kind of almost, I wouldn't say shock you, but kind of surprise and she says she was completely bewildered by what happened in their marriage. First they were lovers, and then it seemed without transition they were enemies. She never understood it. There's no explanation as to why this is going on. There's no explanation as to why. The narrator doesn't comment on or give us a reason why these things happen or reason why she's drinking. I mean, you're just told what happens. You're not told the reason for it, in other words. And so the narrator sort of refrains. So there's several different things going on in terms of technique and approach, etc. But I want to talk about placing the text, the short story, in some sort of historical context, because the 1920s was a very important period, obviously, for the emancipation of women. In 1920 itself, the 19th Amendment is passed. Women are given the vote under the Constitution. But it was a decade, everybody knows what was going on during the decade. The Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, that sort of thing. Flappers, there's a flapper up there in the upper right-hand corner. Going to talk a little bit about that because we tend to sort of caricature that era where the women sort of wore these sort of shorter skirts and they bobbed their hair, which was kind of, really, really risque or very, very forbidden in some ways. It was a very rebellious thing. But underneath all that and behind all that, the thing that irritates me the most is that people love to dress up like flappers for Halloween costume parties. And that's very unfortunate because it kind of sells short what was actually happening during the era. Women were redefining themselves in a way that they had never before in the history of the Western world done. That they were emancipating themselves. They were deciding with everything from fashion to their lifestyles, to their relationships, to their hairdos, to everything, were, especially younger women, were really striking out a much more independent place for themselves. And so the modern woman was the topic of the age, and that's not necessarily a complimentary thing when people talked about the modern woman. When you read people who were writing at the time about the modern woman this and the modern woman that and the new woman and all this, they're talking about the fact that in a very short period of time, women went from essentially possessions of their husbands and fathers to independent young women who lived on their own and who lived by their own code and their own rules, and in many respects didn't just deviate, but took great pride in deviating from societal norms. And you can take a look at some of the different sorts of things, their outfits. It's a very famous short story called Bernice Bobs Her Hair, Fitzgerald. And others write about these sorts of flappers and modern young women. But the flapper caricature is kind of unfair because most of these young women were not living a really hedonistic lifestyle. They were just dressing like the ones down in the bottom middle there in a different form. Look at the dresses. They were very long-waisted dresses. There's almost like no midsection to it. It's down around their hips even. Flat-chested, de-emphasizing the bust line. Very different from 20 years earlier or 30 years earlier where the bust line was accentuated. The bustle in the back kind of accentuated the rear end and that sort of thing. Very shapely. No corsets, right? So it's not an hourglass figure. It's a very, very almost boyish kind of look, but it's a shorter dress. It shows ankle. It shows calves, which would have been really kind of, racy at the time. So, and the hats were sort of this wonderful personal self-expression thing. All the hats that they wore, the different styles. It was fun to wear hats, lots of them, lots of different ones. You wore a different one for your mood, whatever mood you were in. And it was a lot of fun for a lot of these young women. The long pearl necklaces, strings of pearls and things. And it was an era where young women who were in their teens and 20s would hang out together and didn't have to be in the company of men to have a good time. They had their own lives. In other words, they had independence. Many of them were working women for a change, and they didn't just go straight from daddy's house to their husbands. There was a period of young, youthful independence that a lot of these women explored. It was also a period of the jazz clubs and the jazz age and nightclubs and, dancing and speakeasies, prohibition, but they still found a way to drink, right? Because we all know that. And a lot of them smoked. I remember that my grandmother, who was born in 1905 and would have been sort of this era. She got married when she was 17 or 18, so she didn't really have a lot of independence. But she was independent enough to have, unfortunately for her, decided that she wanted to become a smoker. And she smoked cigarettes. Now, prior to the 1920s, women who smoked cigarettes were just seen as just terrible, terrible immoral people. These were just the most scandalous. That was one of the scandalous things you do. A woman to smoke a cigarette. Just what kind of other things must she be indulging in, for heaven's sakes? But these young women wanted to live their own lives, wanted to dress their own way, wanted to have their own independence, their own jobs, their own whatever. And part of that culture was having a good time, going out with the girls or guys and girls, and enjoying their youth. And so it's the birth of youth culture in some ways, for women anyway. There'd always been boys who had gone out, young men who'd gone out for a good time with the guys, but it wasn't something that girls did. They largely didn't. But this era is an era where we see that. And part of this is really fueled by the cinema icons of the silent era. And I've got two of them down below there. On the left is Louise Brooks, and on the right is Clara Bow. Clara Bow was described as the it girl, right? She was the most popular film actress, prior to the 1930s. There's just no question about it. The most, maybe Mary Pickford early on, but certainly in the 1920s, Clara Bow was it. She was everything, and she was this kind of sort of youthful, kind of innocent, naive, and yet fun-loving sort of mix of both innocence and sexiness kind of thing. And so she could look sultry, but she also had a sort of innocent vulnerability about her and those kinds of things. Louise Brooks on the left-hand side was not as popular a film actress, but she, in terms of her style as a model and her hairdo, that flipped around, curled around little bit on both sides there with the bobbed hair became a just all the rage for a couple of years as a hairdo. She starred in a couple of films that were quite scandalous. Pandora's Box was one that was really very controversial. She went on to really have a very declined career. Both of them didn't have very happy lives after their film careers, but they were the model of this new modern young woman in America. And of course, a lot of the older people said, this is the end of civilization as we know it. They're all going to burn in hell. We're all going to go down the crapper because the country is now, we shouldn't have given them the vote, and look at what's happened now. I mean, this was the topic of the era. This was the social topic of the era in the 1920s. It wasn't yet, for example, civil rights. That didn't come, unfortunately, until after World War II. But 1920s, despite the vote being, passed in the 19th Amendment, it was still a big question about women's status, the women question in the minds of many people. What have we unleashed in the minds of some people? Others are saying, thank goodness now we can live our own lives, sort of thing. Well, the reason I bring all of that up is, of course, because Hazel Morse is a younger woman at the beginning of this short story, and is a part of this era. And this is not a happy outcome. I don't know that I would read this and say that this is somehow Dorothy Parker's condemnation of this new modern woman's emancipation. kind of thing. I don't think that she's at all critical of that. If anything, Parker was very staunchly a person who advocated women's rights and the rights of others as well. But so she was, she was always someone who, hung around with a lot of male counterparts, the Algonquin roundtables that she was a part of that met editors, publishers, writers who got together and did an awful lot of drinking. And but on the other hand, were the very heart, the very epicenter of the literary and cultural world of New York. She was, the pivotal figure of that, to be honest with you. Fantastic writer, supreme wit. She's hardly someone who would say, well, we've unleashed something terrible here with the independence of young women. Look at poor Hazel. I don't think that's what we should read in this. I really don't think that at all. But what we are presented with is the story of a young woman who is essentially directionless, and her life is one of banality. It's a series of meaningless experiences. She takes up with another guy and another guy and another guy, and she doesn't know what she wants. She doesn't know what would make her happy. She doesn't know what would be a fulfilling life for herself. She simply goes from experience to experience, relationship to relationship, and to fill a lot of that void, she turns, of course, to alcohol and eventually attempts suicide. Does not succeed. Just like Parker attempted suicide on a couple of occasions and did not succeed. And Parker once quipped, I think, I was a success. I was not much of a success in life, and I was an even bigger failure in death, because she wasn't successful in actually committing suicide. She had a very dark sense of humor, but she was great with the one-liners. Some of them are probably not intended for family audiences, but they were still witty nonetheless. Brilliant, sharp wit. So I don't think that we should read this story and say, this is a cautionary tale about young women being too emancipated. I don't think that's I think the way I approach it, and I would invite you to approach it that way too, or at least think about this, is what happens to a generation of young women when we open up the doors and give them all this freedom, but we didn't really actually prepare them for what it's like to actually make choices in your life, and the necessary step of thinking about what you want in your life before trying to strike out and get that thing. Okay, 100% freedom and 0% preparation for it. 0% thought about what do I want in my life, because Hazel just kind of strikes up with a guy and she likes him, and he's a terrific guy. Herbie is somebody she has a lot of fun with. Somewhere along the way, Hazel never got prepared for what married life is like. Hazel never got prepared for something like, what do I want to do with my life, and where do I see myself in 5 or 10 years from now? There's the liberty, but not the planning. There's the liberty, the freedom, but not the thought in advance of, well, what do I do with myself? And so the default for her seems to be to go from a relationship with another guy and another guy and another guy, just like some of these other women across the hallway from her are. These men come and go in her life, and she really does not have any sort of attachment to them at all. She's fond of them, but at one point, when one of them leaves, she says she never thought of his kisses when she was not with him. When he's there, she's like, oh, nice to see you. Yeah, it's fun to hang out with you. But when he leaves, she doesn't miss him. There's no emotional attachment there at all. She accepted her relationship with Ed without question or enthusiasm. It was just, this is what I have to do to make a living, and he pays my bills, and he's a nice man, and whatever. There's nowhere in her life is there this expectation that she's going to have a rich, meaningful, deep relationship with anyone. And that's really sad, because you think, well, if now young women have lots more choices, if now young women have the ability to, sail their own ship and to at least a greater extent than a previous generation, if now women have much more freedom and autonomy, what do you do when you're not equipped to exercise that freedom and autonomy and you haven't done any real preparation and thought about what you want in your life. I think that's part of it. I think the fact that she's directionless, she's rudderless in her life is partly a question of no one really prepared her for being in charge of herself. And so without the answers, she sort of defaults on what's available. So consider her attitude towards men. How would you describe it? It's hard to say that you could say, well, she uses men. Well, yeah, but not in a malicious way, in just kind of a necessary, this is what you do kind of way. I mean, somebody's got to pay the bills. I got to have bills. They seem to like me. I have a good time with them. I mean, it's not just out and out, flat out prostitution. And I don't like these guys and I'll sleep with them because they pay the bills. But when they leave, I can't stand them or anything like that. It's not that at all. It's just sort of, I don't really care about them much. But it's fortunate for me that they're here, because otherwise I don't think I could pay my rent. It's less angry than that, and it's more sad and depressing. Why the title? Why call it Big Blonde? That's an interesting question. I think you should ponder. Why would she call it Big Blonde? It's not Hazel's story, right? It's not Hazel Morse, Lost Soul. It's not that. It's Big Blonde, almost as though she's not a person. She's just a type, I think, in some respects. Naturally, she tries to commit suicide, does not succeed, and then the end of the story is just really sad, if you ask me. It's probably sadder in some respect because she's not successful in ending her life, and then she just simply says, well, I guess the only thing to turn to really is just continued alcoholism. And then that's it. She just wants to stay drunk the rest of her life, and then that's the end of that. Modernism isn't always happy. Frequently it isn't. Maybe most of the time it isn't. But it certainly is something that is a reflection of what's going on and what the concerns are of the era. We're going to continue on with some other pieces that may not be particularly straight up in the modernist tradition, but certainly owe a lot to this movement and this era.